All right, in this lecture, we are going to get into, I think, what is, I think, the juiciest and most interesting part of this chapter, which is talking about the conscious parts of the brain, the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is going to be covered in what's called the cerebral cortex. So this is sort of, the cerebral cortex is kind of, I think, probably what you might picture in your mind when you think about the brain. It's going to, again, be the site of all conscious thought. So everything we're consciously perceiving, everything we're deciding, planning, thinking, all that, everything that we're aware of in our brain is going to be happening in the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex in humans has a very characteristic wrinkled appearance. If you look at the brain of other mammals, they don't have as many wrinkles, and it's thought that these wrinkles help to increase the surface area of this conscious part of our brain, which helps to contribute to our intelligence. So I do think we're a bit smarter than mice, and if you look at the brains of mice, their cerebral cortexes are pretty smooth compared to ours. There are three different types of areas within the cerebral cortex. So there are what are called motor areas, which are going to primarily control movement in the body. So there are also, and those are primarily found in the front of the brain. So this is like up here is where the person's forehead would be, and this is the back of the head. This is a side view like this. So this is where your motor areas are going to be. Sensory areas, which are going to be dedicated to processing what we're feeling, our senses, is going to be primarily in the back of the brain. And then throughout the brain, you have a number of what are called association areas. So these are going to be areas where you're bringing in information from a lot of different sources and integrating it together. So those association areas are really critical to kind of our higher level brain function, and not just, using our brain to see or to control our muscles. All right, so a couple of areas that are very interesting within the cortex, the cerebral cortex, are going to be what's called the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex. So those are shown here. This orange stripe is going to be the location of the motor cortex within the brain, and the blue stripe is the area of the somatosensory cortex within the brain. So basically what these are going to be, in the case of the motor cortex, these are going to be cell bodies of neurons that are going to control skeletal muscles in different areas of our body. And so what's shown here, this is called the motor homunculus. So homunculus means little man. This is basically a drawing of which areas of the body the muscles are going to be controlled by stimulating these different parts of the brain. So like this area of the brain contains the cell bodies of neurons that are going to control the muscles that control movement of your eye. This will control the movement of your face and your lips, right? So one thing that you will notice by looking at the motor homunculus is, first of all, that adjacent areas of the body tend to be represented by adjacent areas of the motor cortex. So like your elbow is right next to your forearm is next to your wrist is next to your hand. So it kind of creates like a map in the brain of where those muscles are in your body. Another thing that you will notice, and partly this is why this motor homunculus looks so creepy, is because it's got some structures are much larger than usual and some are much smaller than usual. And this is proportional to how much brain area we have dedicated to controlling the muscles in those parts of the body, right? So you can see that you have a lot of area dedicated to your hand, right? And that's because you have a lot of small muscles in your hand that allow your hands to make very precise movements. Although your elbow and your forearm, right, you might think of those as containing a lot of muscle, but you have less precision in how you move those parts of your body, right? If I strapped a pencil to your shoulder and told you to write your name, it would be very difficult, right? Much more so than using your hand to write. We also have a lot of very precise control over small muscles in our face, especially in our lips, our jaw, our tongue. That's important for us to be able to talk. So you can see here that those areas have a lot of representation. They take up a lot of area in the motor cortex. All right, the blue area is what's called the somatosensory cortex. So again, this is going to be sort of similar, that you see adjacent areas of the body represented by adjacent areas within the cortex. So this side is going to control neurons that are going to control movement. This area is going to contain neurons that allow us to respond to senses. So this is really going to be kind of a map of your sense of touch in your body. So you can see that as with the motor cortex, that adjacent areas of your body tend to be represented adjacently in the somatosensory cortex. So again, your nose is near your eye, your teeth are near your gums or near your jaw or near your tongue, right? And also, as with the motor cortex, in the somatosensory cortex, you can see that some of these structures are much bigger than they are in your body, right? So again, your face is very sensitive, right? And you're able to really pinpoint where something is touching you on your face, much more so than you can like on your trunk, right? So your trunk is a big area of your body, but you're not super sensitive there, right? So you're not able to pinpoint as precisely if somebody were touching you on your trunk exactly where that's coming from. So for both of these areas, we can see that the amount of nervous system attention that is given to that area of the body is going to be proportional to the amount of brain area we have corresponding to that part of the body. And for both of them, we see that adjacent structures in the body tend to be represented in adjacent locations within the cortex. Okay, so part of the cerebral cortex is a part of the brain called the frontal lobe. So it gets its name because it's in the front part of your brain. And so you may have heard the story of a very famous patient named Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker who survived having an iron rod pass through his head. Here is a drawing of this. And one of the very most coolest things about working at MCPHS or going to school there, and I know that a lot of us are not in person this year, but MCPHS is a block away from Countway Library of Medicine, which is part of Harvard Medical School. It is open to MCPHS students not during COVID times, but eventually it will be again. And within the Countway Library, they have something called the Warren Anatomical Museum, which is a museum of anatomical abnormalities. And they have Phineas Gage's actual skull on display there. So I've seen it. You can see his actual skull. You can actually see the hole in it. So ordinarily you would think that having this kind of injury, having a railroad spike pass through your head would kill you, but it did not kill him. It did change his personality though. And this led to a lot of understanding of how this part of your brain, the frontal lobe, contributes to your overall function. So the frontal lobe is very important for controlling your personality. And it was later discovered, partly as a result of learning from Phineas Gage's injury, that in patients who had psychiatric illness, or in some cases patients who had severe developmental delays. So it used to be that back until pretty recently, if you had a child with one of those things, that you would send them off to an institution. It was thought that people, that you couldn't raise a child who had severe psychological problems or who had severe learning disabilities, and they were better off going to a specialized institution, where generally speaking, they were not treated very well. And one of the problems that people who ran these institutions had was that sometimes people who had these significant psychiatric issues or significant learning differences, when they were put in this institutionalized setting, sometimes they would be difficult to control. So it was discovered that if you separate the frontal lobe of the brain from the rest of the brain through a process called a frontal lobotomy, that you could basically cut off that part of the brain and it would make people more docile. They would be less aggressive, less defiant. And so this was something that started to be used on a widespread basis to control people. In fact, probably the most famous patient who underwent a lobotomy was Rosemary Kennedy, who was the sister of President John F. Kennedy. So she suffered a hypoxic brain injury when she was born. So she was born at home, not in a hospital, as almost all babies were in that time. And there was difficulty during the birth. And so during birth, she was deprived of oxygen for some period of time, and that affected her brain and her brain development. So like most kids who had atypical brain development during that time, she was sent to live in an institution. There's a lot been written about this. So the family did make the decision to have her undergo this surgery. And she actually lived a really long time. She lived until, I think she died sometime within the last 10 years, but she lived all her life with this surgery, which permanently changed her personality. So this is considered now to be inhumane to do this, to purposely cause brain damage in people to make them more easily controlled. So obviously there's a lot of problems with that. But this is something that used to be done pretty routinely to patients patients who were in institutions. There's also a very famous book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which deals with this surgery. It's no longer done. It's not considered to be a humane thing to do anymore, but it is a big part of our a big and unfortunate part of our medical history and of the way that we have traditionally treated institutionalized people. All right, moving on to happier things. I did want to talk a little bit about language and speech. So obviously very complicated, but I wanted to highlight a couple of areas that are involved in this. So language and speech are going to be concentrated in most people on the left side of the brain and not on the right side of the brain. You typically have all of your language and speech together. So one important brain area for understanding language is going to be what's called Wernicke's area. So that's located within this green area here. Another area which is close to it is called Broca's area. So it is in the frontal lobe up here, and it's important for producing language. So Wernicke's area and Broca's area are both involved in understanding both spoken and written language. They're primarily for spoken language. So written language involves not just one brain area, it involves a lot of different brain areas. So it's very interesting. Our brains are really well evolved to produce and understand speech. And a very large percentage of people, even if they have significant learning disabilities, learn to speak and to understand spoken language. Understanding and producing written language is significantly harder for a lot of us, right? So a lot of kids, I'm sure some of you struggled a lot in school when it came time to learn how to read and to write. And this is probably a relic of the fact that our brains have adapted over millions of years, right, to be able to understand and produce spoken language. Written language has not been around for that long, right? So even if you went back like 100 years ago to the 1920s, a large proportion of people never learned to read or write, right? Or if you go back even further, like 300 or 400 years, it used to be that only the very rich people were able to get educated to be able to write and to read. So our brains have not really caught up to the writing and reading area as well as they have adapted to being able to produce and understand spoken language. So it's much more complicated from a brain perspective to read and write than it is to talk and to understand speech. So again, both of these are found in the left hemisphere of the brain in most people. And this is an example of a phenomenon called lateralization that is very important in humans in particular. So lateralization means having certain things either only on the left side or only on the right side of the brain, right? So this is kind of an aberration, right? For the most part, everything you have on the left side of your body, you have on the right side of your body, right? You have 2 arms, 2 lungs, 2 ears, right? And in most animals, the brain is also very symmetrical. But humans have adapted to have more specialization of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. So in most people, as I mentioned, the left hemisphere is dominant for language, and the right hemisphere uses those same areas for visual spatial skills. So I put this is true for most people, more than 90% of people. So there is a substantial minority of people who don't have this organization and who have language on the right side and the visual spatial on the left side. But most people have it set up this way. It is also linked to handedness. So if you are left-handed, you are more likely to have language on the right side of your brain rather than on the left side of your brain. And as I mentioned, other mammals show a lot less lateralization and more just redundancy between the right and left sides of the brain. So one example of this is in aquatic mammals. So you may have heard that dolphins are notable for having very large brains. But we think that one of the reasons why dolphins are actually not quite as smart as we are, despite the fact that they have big brains, is that they and some other aquatic mammals like manatees, they actually have more redundancy on the left and right sides of their brain, and they actually sleep with one hemisphere of their brain at a time. And it's thought to be an adaptation to being a mammal living underwater, because if I were to put you underwater when you were asleep, what would happen is you have this breathing reflex that would kick in, and if you're underwater, that's not good. So dolphins and manatees and some other aquatic mammals, they sleep with one hemisphere at a time, and they in this way can avoid that gasping reflex that would cause them to inhale water. But it means that basically they're only using half their brain at a time. The two cerebral hemispheres are connected to each other primarily by a pretty small structure called the corpus callosum. So in many ways, you kind of, so people talk about being right-brained and left-brained, and a lot of that is honestly just completely made up. But it is true that you have a lot of separation between the left and right hemispheres of your cerebral cortex, and a relatively small area in which they communicate with each other. So in a way, you kind of do have two brains, but they're both trapped within the same person. So they have a lot of the same experiences, obviously. All right. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about traumatic brain injuries. So this is obviously something that affects many people. The most common cause of traumatic brain injuries is car accidents, although thankfully the rate of that is going down as we improve automobile safety. But also this can occur in war. It can happen as a result of being shot in many cases. So I wanted to talk about kind of different levels of TBI. The most mild type of traumatic brain injury is what's called a concussion. So in some cases, it results in a temporary loss of consciousness, but maybe not. So it used to be thought that concussions were just no big deal at all, right? Most mild level of traumatic brain injury. But now we are, unfortunately, from data from the National Football League, learning a lot more about the fact that if you have repeated concussions, as many football players do, over time, they can cause really severe impairment of the brain, and they can lead to changes in personality and changes in mood that can often be, we've had a number of NFL players go on to commit suicide as a result of the damage that was caused to their brain by these repeated concussions. A more serious level of traumatic brain injury is what's called an intracranial hemorrhage. That's caused by bleeding within the brain. One of the challenges of brain injuries is that your brain is contained within a rigid bony structure, your skull. And so it's sort of unlike the rest of your body, right? The other parts of your body don't have a layer of bone on the outside. And certainly in one sense, it's good to have your skull there to protect your brain. But it can also, if you're bleeding in your brain and you start to have blood accumulate, that can actually, your brain doesn't have anywhere to go. And it can actually lead to damage to brain tissue as a result of the blood pushing on areas of the brain that are damaged. Related to this, if you do have a traumatic brain injury that's serious, oftentimes the brain will swell as a result of that. So that's called cerebral edema, when you have swelling of the brain as a result of an injury. And again, if you have swelling happening and you have a skull there, that can cause further damage to the brain because the brain pushes on the skull and it actually gets damaged by that physical pressure of the skull. So sometimes when somebody does have a significant brain injury, they might actually remove part of the skull temporarily, and they usually implant it in another part of the person's body, most likely in the abdomen, to keep that skull tissue alive. And then eventually, once the swelling has gone down, they will replace that part of the skull that they saved and put it back in the head. All right, and then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about stroke. We talked about this before when we were talking about the cardiovascular system, but so stroke is basically the brain version of a heart attack. So in a heart attack, you have a blood clot that blocks the flow of blood to the heart. A stroke is going to be a blood clot that blocks the flow of blood to the brain. And brain tissue is very similar to heart tissue in that if it's deprived of blood, even for a very short time, it dies. And like heart tissue, we have very limited regenerative ability. So after people have a stroke, they often have deficits that they never are able to fully come back from. One of the most common things that can happen after a stroke is that a stroke can affect Wernicke's area or Broca's area or both. And that can produce a reduced ability to produce and understand either written and or spoken language. So this is going to be very common after stroke that affects the left hemisphere, which many strokes do.